Hey, I recently appeared on a panel at something called the Provocations Festival in Toronto at Innis Town Hall at Innis College, University of Toronto. It turned out to be a pretty good chat. I was speaking with Jeffrey Dvorkin, who was running things in NPR and CBC in various capacities before becoming a journalism prof, and Anita Li, who is behind the Toronto local news site, The Green Line. And Sabreena Delhon from the Samara Center was the moderator. Anyhow, the topic was the promise and perils of digital in news. And we covered a ton of ground. It got pretty lively. And so we thought we would bring you, our supporters, a recording of that conversation. Thank you to the Provocations Festival. Thank you for supporting Canadaland. Here is that discussion.
Okay, welcome everybody to the Promise and Perils of Digital. So we're going to have a great conversation today about how digital tech is shaping our democracy in various aspects of it. I'm going to give a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. So Anita Li is CEO and Editor-in-Chief of The Green Line, a local Toronto-based news outlet. Jesse Brown is publisher and editor-in-chief of Canadaland, a news site and network of podcasts on Canadian media, news, politics, and other topics. And Jeffrey Dvorkin is author of Trusting the News in a Digital Age and is a senior fellow at Massey College. So I want to touch on the results that Mark just shared with us, the poll that was conducted by Innovative Research Group for the festival. So it looked at whether the rise of digital media was making our democracy stronger or weaker, and the respondents were fairly evenly split across stronger, weaker, or no difference. But so much of our conversation about digital media is about platforms and largely alarm about their role in generating mis and disinformation. And that's kind of keeping us in a binary space where you're either for or against technology or for or against truth, facts, journalism. I'm wondering what's getting missed in the conversation. Anita, can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. I often think when we talk about innovation in journalism, we talk about it from a technological perspective. So as journalists, we're always thinking about the newest emerging platform, whether that's TikTok or Substack, and how we're able to meet our audience there. But I often find, and in my own practice as head of a hyperlocal independent news outlet that's very digitally focused, is more about innovating the practice of journalism. I mean, in maybe 10, 15, 20 years, TikTok's not going to be very relevant. And so at this point in history, we're noticing that the way we communicate and relate to each other is much more different. It's much more decentralized. And as a result, I think a lot more about innovating in the practice of journalism and our approach. For example, there are things that the Green Line practices like community-driven journalism, where we consult communities about the issues they care about, as opposed to, the traditional top-down model where, an editor decides the news of the day. There's also solutions-focused journalism that really reports less on, rather than if it bleeds, it leads. We're really focused on, reporting on existing solutions to systemic problems. There's also, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the discussion about whether objectivity is a valid kind of, frame for journalism as well. And these days, more and more, there's things like trauma-informed journalism practices, given that we understand how, intergenerational trauma has impacted systems and generally humanity. So these are things I think that journalism needs to, that's the missing kind of middle in the gap, that we need to actually pay less attention to some of these, alarmism around technology, and more about really kind of leaning into what we understand about just the truths of humanity that we've known for since the beginning of civilization, is how I kind of see the way we evolve journalism.
Yeah, I agree in broad strokes that we're very quickly accepting the terms of this binary. We're very quickly, there's a shorthand. Platforms equal noise, equal disinformation, misinformation, bad stuff, digital. And then we are creating this other bucket of the good stuff. And I don't think you can have that conversation or accept the terms of that binary without looking at the political reality that in that bucket of the good stuff is an industry that is in sharp decline, that is seizing upon that narrative to basically become a special interest that builds a case for permanent government support on that dichotomy that we are needed in the legacy news world to fight the platforms and everything that happens on the platforms, and to fight the disinformation and misinformation. And that's really worth taking apart. It's really worth examining, which I know we're going to do a bit today. But I think as a starting position, we have to, it's not necessarily that I want to. We have to be really clear about what we're talking about and avoid a lazy default to those binaries.
Well, I have to agree for now, because I was told it's okay to be provocative here. So I'm going to be a little, don't run me out on a rail too quickly. Couple of things. I'm a recovering news manager at CBC Radio and National Public Radio. And in both places, my job was to implement digital while making cuts. Because the rationalization at the CBC was that you've got all these journalists, and do you need all of them? And now you've got digital, and they can do the job more quickly. I think AI is also premised on that, and for my sins, I'm connected to a group of advisors to business, and I see their their email exchanges, and they're just salivating over the possibility of AI, which is going to restore to grandeur the lost opportunities that COVID inflicted on us. I mean, it's grotesque, but that's just my opinion. That's my provocative opinion. I think one of the things that I found at the CBC, and again at NPR, was that the desire to prove to whoever gives you money that you are incredibly efficient at what you're doing drives the implementation of technology. And what compounds this is a kind of status anxiety that journalists have. They're not really professionals. They don't come out of med school or law school or dentistry and say, okay, now I'm a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist. They come out of journalism school or the practice of journalism and can claim their status, but no one really believes them. And that's part of their anxiety. So that there's this rush towards what I call credentialism. I'm a journalist, you can trust me. I'm a journalist, I've been in a war zone. I'm a journalist, I know the prime minister. It's bullshit. It's just nonsense. And what digital has done, if digital were a term paper in one of my classes at U of T, I would give it maybe a B-, maybe C+, because the problem with all of these things is they're fads. And very powerful fads, but they are fads. And at the CBC, my bosses wanted to prove to their masters in Ottawa, we're just as goddamn efficient as anybody in commercial radio. So let's fire 30% of the staff and replace them with digital technology, which is what I had to do. It was not very pleasant, and I'm still wake up in the middle of the night shaking. At NPR, they were a little more sophisticated about it because I had a boss, great boss, who said, all right, we're going to do this. Now I want you all, he'd say to his managers, what's the downside? Let's imagine what the downside is. And that was a moment of clarity. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, first as citizens, is to help ourselves understand what the implications of anything we claim to do can be. And I think that this is the missing link. And here's where I'm really going to put my neck out. I think EDI is a fad. I think that people are, certainly in the academy, are talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion without ever really understanding what the hell those words mean and what the implications of, what is equity? I don't know what equity is. Does it mean that we're all equal? Do we all have equal results? Diversity I get, inclusion I get, but equity is, to me, is a big problem. Yet, I see that there has been an explosion, I'm being provocative here, there's been an explosion of what's been called educrats. The bureaucracy of education where you have committee after committee after committee in order to establish EDI in the Academy and in the CBC and at NPR. But for what purpose? And that's the missing, to me, that's the missing question. And in the end, I think that a lot of, I'll shut up shortly. I think one of the things that bothers me about this culture, this digital culture, is not that it's inclusive, it's exclusive. It says, you're okay, but you're not. I'm okay, and you're not. And I think that until we figure out a way in which we can use the technology to be inclusive, not to be just, I'm different, therefore I am. I think that's what we'll do. I was in a staff meeting at U of T, and a South Asian professor said, without looking at me, said, there are too many people in this room who are male, stale, and pale. I was so offended, but it was painful because yes, I'm male, yes, I'm pale. I don't think I'm too stale, and in fact, day-old bread can be very nutritious. So consider me your day-old bread.
So a lot of what you just outlined there, Jeffrey, in terms of the corporate culture within the media relates to my next question, which is for Jesse, that the launch of Canadaland was about having an alternative to legacy media and the national broadcaster. I'm wondering how your relationship to the journalism ecosystem has changed as increasingly we've been facing threats to our democracy related to mis and disinformation, and how that relates to the kind of institutional cultural context that Jeffrey just outlined for us.
Okay. Threats to our democracy from misinformation and disinformation. And again, I think that we have the shorthand. So what are the threats that misinformation and disinformation poses to our democracy? I think that we very quickly are like, well, what is that misinformation, disinformation? Anti-vaxxers are the ones doing the disinformation, the intentional, bad science, that would be disinformation, or Russian, Chinese state propaganda, that would be misinformation. What's threatening our democracy? It's that stuff. It's always something that we imagine as afflicting somebody else. I don't feel particularly afflicted by anti-vaxxer disinformation. I didn't wake up this morning like none of that. I know that information exists. I don't feel like it harmed my life. As far as I know, Russian and Chinese state misinformation, disinformation is something that some other person is falling for. Somebody on WhatsApp out there. It's always somebody else who's the idiot who's falling for this. They're in some bubble, and we're supposed to be like, we have to do something about these people who are being fooled. But the question is, what is the harm that misinformation and disinformation is posing to our democracy? Well, one example, this past week in Parliament, the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, has presented Trudeau with a major campaign against the safer supply drug policy. And all of his MPs, many of his MPs are tweeting about this, and they are claiming that there is hard proof that the safer supply program, which is an effort to curb the toxic drug deaths from fentanyl, over 30,000 Canadians have died. The Trudeau government has been giving people safe supply, and it's a disaster. This is the story that they're telling, and I'll be brief with this, but the story is a very scary one, that government-provided drugs are flooding Canada. There is a new opioid crisis. Forget the fentanyl toxic drug. This is a new one where the government is spreading these hydromorphone pills, and it's as big as the OxyContin crisis, okay? They are explicitly citing a National Post article that was published just earlier this month. It went very quickly, and not a lot of people read this article. It's paywalled, and the National Post has not done a very good job of convincing Canadians that their news is worth paying for. Actually, show of hands if you have a subscription to the National Post paywall, if you can access this article.
It's not a representative sample.
One of them? Okay. Yeah, it's not, yeah. We have one person in this theater who, so this is an article that is informing, it is the sole evidentiary basis, as far as I can tell, for a Conservative campaign, which ultimately may be Conservative policy. I think there's a good chance that Pierre Poilievre will be Prime Minister one day, and it's based on this piece. Well, we read the piece. It's 11,000 words. It does not contain any data at all that substantiates the scope of hydromorphone, because there's only 28 of these safe supply programs in Canada. Some of them, like the one in Parkdale, has like 86 people in it, right? So how many of these hydromorphone pills is the government handing out? And what's, like, fentanyl kills people, street fentanyl. What is the impact of these hydromorphone pills? There's no indication in the piece. And the only thing we know is from the BC coroners that there's no indication from actual drug deaths of safe supply drugs contributing to these deaths. And yet we're told that this is an epidemic on the scale of OxyContin, okay? So when I look at misinformation and disinformation and its impact on our democracy, I'm still focused where I was when Canadaland started. When I look at the Canadian media and its support for Canada entering the Iraq War, when I look at, the Canadian media and its early messaging that we shouldn't be wearing masks. Is this misinformation or, accidental? Disinformation intentional? Courts have trouble, figuring out intent. Because the National Post is so intertwined explicitly, and this is a Canadaland investigation into the very explicit campaign or movement from corporate in the Post media to become more conservative, and we see the close connection between conservative policy and what's published in these papers, and we've exposed an internal plan at the Toronto Sun to help Doug Ford become premier. So, where is that influence on our democracy? And again, returning to, we're supposed to be all aligned in opposition to these other misinformation, disinformation players, and we need to redouble our commitment to legacy journalism, and we need to fund, a foreign-owned newspaper chain like Post Media with public money forever, because that is the bulwark that we have to help us against this misinformation, disinformation. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. I think there's some interesting things happening in the outer fringes. I think Russian and Chinese state misinformation, it exists. We look at it. Journalists should look at it. But if the concept is that the game has changed and the focus now needs to be on all of this chaotic stuff out there, no, I still disproportionate to, because as Jeffrey can probably, there's plenty of data showing that our trust in legacy media is like fallen off a cliff. Our consumption of articles like that National Post article has fallen off a cliff, but the relationship between that legacy media and policymakers is still strong. It's still a solid vector of power and information informing policy. So I think that we still are mostly focused there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree a lot of with what you said. And in the context of Bill C-18 in particular, there's been discussions, largely legacy media have driven that conversation, and emerging media have been left out in the cold. And it's this kind of weird dominance, persistent dominance of legacy media, despite the fact that they weren't able to diversify their business models to be sustainable and survive. And I do I do have to give credit to Canadaland and actually Jesse for being one of the first publications that actually held establishment media and it to account, because our media ecosystem has historically been so centralized, and CBC is at the head of that. Essentially, it's one of the most, one of the biggest employers of media jobs across the country. And so, especially as a young journalist coming up, and I recall way back when I started out, there was never any accountability for our for media, essentially, especially establishment legacy media, for that reason, because it was so centralized that if you kind of held them to account, you might not be employed by them. So that's obviously changing now, which I'm really happy about. There's been an emergence of a digital media explosion in the last few years of, smaller digital outlets like myself, like the Green Line, as well as solopreneurs, a lot of people, launching their own newsletters on Substack, leaving traditional media, independent, very talented investigative reporters starting their own, Substacks or newsletters, for example. And that has resulted in a much healthier, I find, media ecosystem where there is, accountability. And in fact, one of my employees, Aloysius Wong, actually recently, he's a CBC Donaldson, he's a Donaldson at the CBC, which is a really top intern, and he actually wrote a piece about CBC's poor labor practices and keeping people on contract for years and years and years. And I was really proud of him, but also this is the first time I've ever seen a young journalist do that and be brave enough to do that, because I think the time is now.
Right, and that's a bit of an open secret. And the facility that emerging media has had with digital technologies has enabled you to do this accountability work. I'm wondering if you can reflect on that, Jeffrey.
Well, a couple of things. One is that when I came back to to Canada from the States, I proposed to the CBC that I start a media criticism show. And
You can still do it.
no, I may not. I was told they sent one of my early copy clerks to tell me buzz off, which is a little interesting. And he said, no, the problem with having a media show on the CBC is that you'll end up criticizing first the CBC and then our competitors. And we don't want that. We don't want to be seen to be critical. We want to be nice. We want everyone to like us. So it's about reputation enhancement more than anything else. The other thing, and Mark, forgive me, I think the polling that's done in general is pretty shitty. I'm sure there are many fine variables in your poll, but I've noticed that as news organizations have laid people off, they're filling the news hole with polling and using that as a kind of an excuse for news. And it's really interesting that just before the 2016 election in the United States, there was only one newspaper in the entire United States that said, Trump's going to win. Everybody else said, well, the polls say that Hillary's going to win. And the one newspaper that said it's going to be Trump was the LA Times, because they decided to send reporters out to talk to people. And that became the critical difference. And what we have now in this country, because there have been so many layoffs and there's been so much what they call convergence of media, we have deep news deserts in this country. Yeah, Toronto's pretty good and Montreal's excellent, a little bit in Vancouver, but basically the rest of the country can take a hike. And when it comes to giving them reliable news and information. So what replaces the ability to do kind of contextual news is what I call the low-hanging fruit of local news, which is weather, traffic, and crime. It's easy to get. It's all handed over by the government, or various government bodies. And that's why you have, it was interesting, I would ask my class, first-year journalism students, very diverse, out in Scarborough, and I would ask them, how many of you think that Toronto is a very dangerous place and getting more dangerous? All the women in the class put up their hands. The men, being macho, said, yeah, we can handle it. But they came to me afterwards and said, yeah, we're worried too. And I said, well, where are you getting your information from? And they were getting it from local talk radio and CP24. CP24, in my opinion, does a very good job at many levels, but it's still filling the news hole with the latest murders and traffic accidents and floods and all that stuff, because it's easy. And there's no contextual reporting, or very little contextual reporting going on. I happen to be talking to the host of the afternoon drive show in Saskatoon, and she interviewed me on something, and I chatting away, and after they turned off the recording, I said, what's it like now? And she says, it's horrible. I said, why? She said, because I'm the only one here. I have to gather the news, do the interviews, read the newscasts, read the weather forecast, and then start all over again. I'm exhausted. And I think that the CBC, we can get into this, has decided that it wants to be a playa. It wants to create programs that are so appealing to an American audience that they've taken money out of other budgets and put them into these comedy and reality shows. And what they've done is they are not serving the people of Canada and the way that I think they should be. But anyway, that's just my opinion.
If there's some CBC bashing going on,
I'll cue it up, Jesse. Just one sec. So what we've explored so far is, this intersection of the status anxiety that you mentioned, Jeffrey, efficiency, a reactive kind of posture from media organizations in response to digital. We've seen digital become the business case for all media as well. And I'm wondering how this has constrained journalism as a profession. You just alluded, Jeffrey, that there are some real consequences to collegiality, sense of community, the craft, how that's learned and understood. And also, this has a toll on what we understand at the local level in terms of news. And broadly, I'm wondering what's the impact on the public good? Because we understand this from the profession side, from a business side, but why should we care? What does it mean in terms of public good and democratic culture?
My sense is that when you provide information without context, you drive people further to the right on the political spectrum because they are fearful. And when they see that their world is dangerous, they will either consume more of that or they will go watch cat videos or pornography, depending on their personal taste. Cat pornography, too. What a thought. But what we're finding, what I'm seeing, is that the reason that journalism is failing is that it's not providing enough context about anything. Yeah, you have to report crime and weather and traffic and all that stuff, but do it contextually. Does it mean anything, or is it just, if we reported more traffic jams, people would be terrified to drive in this town. So not everything does get reported or deserves to be reported. And I think that that's part of the problem that we're now facing, that we have, I'm going back on my old mantra, but I now think that the future of journalism is local. It's not network, because network creates this mishmash of stuff that is so quick and unsubstantiated and unsubstantial. One of my students, family came from Uganda. He got a job with CBC.ca. And his shift supervisor said, okay, I want you to go on YouTube, find something vaguely Canadian, write some copy around it, and then we'll put it up, and then it becomes a CBC story. And my student said to his supervisor, said, why don't we do that story ourselves and take it to the next level? And the quote I got from him was that his supervisor said, we don't do that shit. We leave that to global.
Okay. This is a really weird moment right now, and I think it's a decisive moment. A lot of things have fallen down or are in the process of falling down, and they're like, the dust is settling. And we were just discussing earlier, everyone's trying to figure out what to make of the failure of Vice and BuzzFeed. And a lot of hand-wringing, like, oh, it's just another sign of the demise of this whole thing, you know? We're both running profitable, tiny news operations. And I guess where my mind is at is it's aligned with what Jeffrey was saying. We have to just stop getting distracted by all of this nonsense. It's about a return to first principles. So I'm glad that journalism as a speculative bubble for venture capital, to treat journalism like it's like tech startups and pump it full of money as Vice was. And I watch it go, you know, they come to town and there's $50 million and everybody's getting a job and being sent around the world. Offices full of people, and then it just gets driven off a cliff. And yes, there was good work done amidst everything else that was done, and those people are good journalists, and you know that's fine. But the model was flawed. It never made any sense. It was a story being told to legacy media about how they could continue doing business the same way if they just had a new brand that connects with young people, and it never actually connected with young people the way it was supposed to. BuzzFeed had a scheme that if you attract traffic in bulk with the most sticky content possible, that could create, through millions of clicks, pennies per click that a percentage of which could be diverted to do good journalism. It was an interesting theory. It was kind of a modern analog of like the role the newspaper played at a certain point. It wasn't all about news. It was about recipes and, the crossword and the comic section and, and that's the money that pays for the news. So this is the digital corollary. Great idea. It attracted tons of money. It failed. It's not going to work. And so it's going to be very hard for anybody to launch an organization that's based on like, we're going to forget about actually getting anybody to pay for journalism. And for many years now, all of these schemes have been operating. I mean, advice from the start, I think Gavin told me directly, we're never going to ask our audience to pay for this because they won't, right? So that whole thing that we concluded, no one will ever pay for journalism, so we have to find some other way to pay for it. And even to this day, the Toronto Star has some like coffee mail order thing, or like maybe sports betting will pay for journalism. Maybe the government will pay for journalism. Maybe somebody else will pay for journalism. So you ask the question, if I go back in time to the question, it was, about the public good. I don't think about that. I think about running a business. I'm in the news business in a very humble, like day-to-day way, at the scale of like a local restaurant. And I think that is what's going to get us out of this. And what gets erased from this conversation are organizations that have been sprouting up by the dozen. The Green Line is one of them. And there are I think about 150 to 200 in Canada at this point, and they're never in the conversation. They are one-person news outlets, three-person news outlets, five-person news outlets. We are now like an 18-person news outlet, which puts us that's still pretty small, and we're like maybe the biggest or one of the biggest of these new ones. And maybe the biggest is Village Media. Local is what is actually working. And then our interpretation of local is topic specific, right? And we're very careful because we have been expanding. There's a natural thing that happens like, well, what if we did a thing about politics? What if we did a thing about X? What if we're doing a thing about hockey now? And I'm very, very cautious about mission creep and becoming, let's build a media empire. I don't want to build a media empire. The most rare thing we could have is what we have, which is a media company that is sustainable and profitable. The public good kind of takes care of itself because we have to create, the only way that we actually stay sustainable is if we create a service. I don't consider it a product. I consider it a service that people, the public, I guess, find valuable. And so, I want to cut through a lot of noise and a lot of conclusions people reached. Like there's this conclusion people reach, along with no one will ever pay for journalism, is like, well, if you're asking people to pay for news, how many people are going to really do that? And won't most people prefer, I don't know, cat pornography or, and like, that's not a question that other businesses are ever asked. Like if you are suggesting, I want to start a healthy restaurant and it's a business, I want to make money selling healthy food. I was like, you're never going to beat McDonald's. I don't need to beat McDonald's. Is there a market? And the market for actual hard news has never been more than like 10% of adults. It's always been a fraction of a fraction. So we need to actually just get back into the practice of providing a necessary service to the people who are willing to pay for it. And yeah, there are a lot of people who are not willing to pay for it, and they're yelling at each other, and they're sharing all kinds of other content. What does that have to do with the production of journalism? It's part of the world, we'll cover it, but it doesn't really influence, it doesn't need to influence like these, like just a cogent business.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think readers are viewed as citizens, and what you just described, Jesse, is a very degrading view of the citizen as someone who won't pay for good information and good news. And that gets at, our culture of civic engagement in Canada and how if we view someone as a consumer, it's a world of possibility. But when we apply the citizen lens, we get a little mixed up about who's smart and good and is responsible as a citizen.
I very much agree. And we've really created this, like the relationship is so terrible and toxic where the newsmakers, journalists are like, the fucking public, they won't pay. Like simultaneously you're saying, we perform this service that everybody needs for democracy to function. We're the most important people, but these fucking people won't pay for it. So like, that's a terrible relationship to have with the person who you need to pay you to do the service. And in return, we are shocked when the public says, yeah, we don't really care for these journalists. And I think you were pointing to some of the puffed out posture that like it's it's that's what we're doing in response to all of these disastrous changes. Is we're getting even more self-important, and we're doubling down on news voice and like we are the trusted sentinels of truth. And like it's people hate us. Like people really like that alone inspires so much enmity towards reporters. And the success of podcasting, and I think of newsletters as well, has a lot to do with what if we deliver this information in a way that it's not like you must trust me because I am the news. What if we just delivered it like, hi, I've been working on a story. Let me tell you how I got it. And people are like, oh, that makes sense to me.
I think the absence of the scarcity mindset and the status anxiety that we've explored goes a long way for your listener and reader. They feel a little more respected. Anita, you were nodding enthusiastically with local is working. I'm wondering if you can talk about how maybe it's not that these are giant institutions in decline, but institutions that are in a period of evolution and transformation. And, what do you see from your perspective as making a difference right now in terms of the health of our democracy? What's working and what's good?
I was getting so many flashbacks from my time in venture capital-backed publications as you were talking. I was part of an early Web 2.0 publication called Mashable, which rose up alongside BuzzFeed and then crashed and burned unceremoniously. So I had seen this happen already, and that's precisely why I actually left that I was so disillusioned by that model. It was so unsustainable. I was miserable. Just an assembly line of work and putting out a lot of also viral content to feed this idea that we were going to produce really good original journalism, which we did actually. We reported on Ukraine at the time, but it was just not sustainable. And I just want to just wholeheartedly agree with what Jesse said about the fact that there isn't enough attention paid on the things that are actually working. Like some publications that I want to shout out, like the Narwhal, National Observer, the Tyee is actually a long-standing publication. There's also places like The Resolve, and Village Media is doing really great work too. And we just need to shift the conversation onto things that are actually creating sustainable media. And ultimately, I also want to say, like, the conversation about how digital ad dollars are being taken from publications. It's kind of like an older story at this point. Like, for example, Sarah Thompson at Dentsu Media is, having conversations with a lot of local media on the ground to reinvest in, just ad buying agencies are reinvesting into local media as opposed to going to the tech giants like Google and Facebook now, because I think the broader industry, industries that are adjacent to journalism are actually recognizing the need to support journalism. And as long as we're continuing to do quality work that actually serves our audience in a meaningful way, I think it resolves itself.
Yeah. Perhaps also they're seeing, so we'll see what you all think about this, but they're seeing what we are supposed to mean by EDI, ESG, et cetera, imbued in these types of outlets versus larger institutions really failing at trying to make sense of it and response to it. What do you all think of that?
Well, I can definitely respond to that. I actually wrote a newsletter called The Other Wave, which is a journalism innovation newsletter on Substack. And one of my first newsletters was actually a kind of like a spectrum that was based on Simpsons characters of how well media outlets actually honored DEI. And on one end, it was I remember I characterized legacy media outlets as Ralph Wiggum with a finger up his nose. And then there was the really great ones, places like the Narwhal, for example, that really walk the walk. And I think the people who are kind of confused about DEI just don't inherently understand that it's actually great for democracy and humanity as a whole. And I find that frustrating. Usually they're responding to the most hysterical people. It's actually kind of insulting when people are like, yes, this isn't working because of this one hysterical group of people. I'm somebody who very much believes in a DEI. And for me, it's kind of it's a process of kind of getting people to understand the values that everyone brings to the table. And it ultimately, if you actually are, the more you imbue your organizations with folks who represent many Canadian pluralism and truly Canadian multiculturalism, then the more you're going to actually resonate with those folks when you actually serve them through the journalism that you produce.
It's representation.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple concept. I don't know why people get so hysterical about it. It's weird.
Well, we've got a couple minutes for some audience questions right now. Does anybody have a question for the group here? I see, yes, in the green.
Okay, so I heard what you said about decentralizing content and the accountability from the local newsrooms, which I think is amazing and wonderful. However, in terms of decentralizing, like Google, when you look at Google and what they're doing in terms of like actually funding media and being able to buy your ads through and publishing and how your content gets out there, it is so completely centralized. So how would you consider using that? And you talk about mission creep, like where is the mission? Like the mission, as far as I'm concerned, should be to break up Google. And I realize that search, it's important that it is centralized, it's good. However, it's not tied to a local geography, so it can be hurting local markets. How would that look if Google was broken up? How would you leverage that in terms of funding media? And this is very much a funding question.
I have an idea. I wrote an op-ed for the Star a couple of weeks ago. I'm part of a group called Public Broadcasting in Canada for the 21st Century. We've been sort of mulling and nagging and nudging various parts of the ecosystem. It occurred to me a couple of years ago that the future of the CBC is to stand it on its head, to give budget and programming control to the stations, not to come out of Toronto. Toronto can still provide major newscasts, emergency transmissions, but basically, for example, The Current on CBC Radio, which runs at 8:30, I think, in the morning. Maybe in Edmonton it would run better at 5 in the afternoon. It should be up to the local market to determine what serves their audience the best, not out of Toronto. When I got to NPR in 97, I looked at the way the system ran and I said, NPR is doing too much. We're watering everything down in order to give a little bit of something to everybody. NPR is a funny place because the stations actually own the network. The customers own the company, unlike CBC. So we went to the stations and we said, if you wanted NPR to provide something that would serve your audiences best, what would that be? It was a very long and painful discussion, but they came back to us several months later and they said, just give us the best news and information you have. We'll handle culture at the local level because we know what our audience in Houston or Seattle or Kansas City prefer, not you guys in Washington. So I said, fine. So we basically gave away classical music, jazz, spoken word, comedy, drama, gave it to anyone, gave it to any station that wanted to run it and to see how it would work. And if it generated an audience after a certain period of time, then NPR would agree to distribute it on the satellite network that it owns. And so we took the money we had left, and we poured it into news and information. We tripled the ratings in 5 years. And NPR still has the largest radio and audio audience in the United States. Everybody talks about television, passing fad. But radio is really, I think, certainly in the States, is where it's at. And I think that turning everything into a local projection serves democracy, gives you better value, tells different stories. I mean, I was listening online to the morning show, Morning Edition. There was some flooding in eastern Kentucky. And the local reporter, who knew her audience and knew the story better than anyone out of Washington, went out with a search crew to see how many people survived the floods. And she was there when they were rescued. Oh, it was heartwarming. It was about showing that there's a little bit of hope left in this world, not this kind of gloom and doom. I'll make one more point and then I'll shut up. I think we've also become captives by the idea of storytelling. And storytelling is about victimhood. too often. It's not about, here's someone who's survived and done very well and she's okay and her kids are okay. It's about how this person is suffering. And we, the audience, should feel a strong sense of empathy. And I think that's also nonsense, because what it does is it just depresses the hell out of everybody. And I think we need to figure out a better way to tell stories that can also provide some kind of hope for us as a culture and as a community.
Anita, and then Jesse, final thoughts?
Well, the last thing I'd say is that I see kind of society as a funnel, in the sense that, like, there are folks who are, struggling, especially in the city, and a lot of that is largely due to systemic barriers. And I see, like, journalism as kind of a way to fill in gaps in education for how to live in some ways. I feel like a lot of the times we're like inundated with an influx of information that's like new and breaking, but it doesn't really provide a sense of like grounding or context for us to understand how to better lead our lives. And that's fundamentally what journalism was meant to do. So because education is dictated by by policy, and sometimes it can go off the rails, I feel like with especially independent journalism, at least when I think about the Green Line, the way the Green Line approaches journalism, we really practice slow journalism. And it's because we're making concerted effort to create, in some ways, like good citizens, because good citizens actually do ultimately end up supporting democracy and caring about their communities more.
So yes, Google should be broken up. And it won't be. And we have a series called Monopolies that will explain to you in detail what is broken in our competition law and why that's never going to happen. It's fun to have these kind of like 1,000-mile high talks, is like what should be done and what could be done. But day to day, we are trying to get by and make payroll and earn a profit. And I think that day to day, the public can do something about this. And that's just support news. Like we're out here, we're doing this work. If you don't like us, there are others doing it. We're fighting the good fight, and what is like, it will hinge on building that market, growing that market, and getting people committed to and used to a new consumer behavior. I mean, for us, it's a strange one, because it's like we want you to pay for news that we give away for free, which seemed to me a ludicrous idea when I first suggested it to our audience. Thousands of people are doing it now. So now we're, okay, how far can that go? How many people are willing to do that, and what can we give them in exchange for that? So there are other people doing that in all kinds of different models. And that's, I think, where you can actually do something. People can actually be a part of keeping trustworthy information out there. We need to detach the concept of journalism and truth from a handful of specific legacy players, of specific companies. They do not own it. I do believe in journalism. I do believe in it as a process, not the process, but a process of arriving at truth. And I do believe in some of the big talk. I think we need it more than ever. I think it's crucial. I think that there are big threats to us having a common understanding of what is real. And we are this like tiny little sector fighting for the process that arrives at information, where somebody says, well, how do you know that that's true? And I can show you how I got there. And I think that nobody owns that process, but it's a hard process. It's not a profession, it's a craft, it's a labor. And those of us who are like trying to find a way to generate money by performing that labor need more customers. We need more citizens. We just need more audience. That's it.
Well, we'll leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much, the three of you, for your excellent insights. And thank you, Anita, Jesse, and Jeffrey.